Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a really heavy topic, the fentanyl crisis. It's one of those things we hear about all the time, but this time we're really going to try to go beyond just the headlines. We've got some excerpts from a recent video that does a deep dive into the rise of this, incredibly potent and dangerous drug. And I'm really curious to get your take on this because I feel like fentanyl is one of those things that's shrouded in so much like mystery and misinformation.
Yeah, absolutely. What we see with the fentanyl is a fascinating but tragic example of how a, medical tool can morph into a major threat. And it's not just about the drug itself, right? It's about the whole web of production, the trafficking, the geopolitics, all of that fuels this crisis.
Right, and I think that's what we're going to try to kind of unpack today, just to give everyone a sense of the scale of this problem. We're talking about, over 1 million drug deaths in the U.S. since 2000. And fentanyl alone has been responsible for over 81,000 deaths just last year. I mean, put that in perspective, that's more lives lost than in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars combined, which is just mind-blowing.
It really is a staggering statistic, and a lot of that comes down to just how potent fentanyl is. It's a synthetic opioid, which means it's human-made, and get this, it's 50 times stronger than heroin. A lethal dose is as little as 2 milligrams.
Wait, 2 milligrams? That's like less than a pinch of salt, right? No wonder it's become such a deadly force. I mean, it's hard to even fathom.
Exactly. And the problem is that the, illicit production and distribution of fentanyl have exploded in recent decades. It's become so readily available, and that easy access combined with its potency makes it incredibly dangerous.
So where is all this fentanyl coming from? The video we're looking at talks about this, like global smuggling pipeline, and it seems like China is right at the heart of it. It sounds like something out of a spy movie, honestly.
It really does. You have Chinese companies that produce the raw materials needed to make fentanyl, and some of these companies are operating legally. Some of them even have the support of the Chinese government.
Hold on, wait a minute. So you're saying the Chinese government is actually supporting companies that make ingredients for this deadly drug? Why would they do that? It seems like totally counterintuitive.
Well, the Chinese government's position is that these materials have legitimate uses in other industries. And they've also argued that they've cooperated with the U.S. by cracking down on, specific chemicals when asked. Their stance is basically that the fentanyl problem is mostly driven by demand in the U.S.
So they're saying, like, hey, we're doing our part, but it's your problem, America.
That's essentially their argument, but it's definitely a contentious point. I mean, there are legitimate uses for these chemicals, but there's also no doubt that a lot of it is being diverted to produce massive amounts of fentanyl. And that's where the Mexican cartels come in. Specifically, the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels. They have these incredibly sophisticated networks for turning those raw materials into fentanyl and smuggling it into the U.S.
It's just crazy to think about the sheer volume of fentanyl being trafficked. I mean, the video mentioned that just 1 kilogram of pure fentanyl contains enough lethal doses to kill 500,000 people.
500,000 people. That's just an unimaginable tragedy contained in such a small amount. It really highlights the deadly efficiency of this whole operation. And, within this vast network, there are some individuals who have become infamous for their role in the fentanyl trade. One name that really stands out is Juan Fatia.
Juan Fatia, yeah. The video made him sound like some kind of, criminal mastermind.
Yeah.
A fentanyl kingpin with a $5 million bounty on his head, like something out of a movie.
He's definitely a key figure in this whole thing. Fatia runs a group of companies that produce fentanyl precursors, including one called Yuansheng Technology. But the really, impressive part is his distribution network. He uses online stores to sell these materials all over the world, even reaching all 50 states here in the U.S.
So he's basically using the internet to run a global drug empire, and it's happening right under our noses. It's kind of scary how easy it seems to be.
Yeah, the accessibility is definitely unsettling. And the impact of Fatia's operation is just staggering. The source claims his network shipped $280 million worth of chemicals in just 5 years, enough to potentially kill the entire U.S. population.
Wow, that's a chilling thought. So, okay, we've established that China plays a major role in supplying the ingredients for fentanyl, but the video also dives into this more controversial question. Is China intentionally fueling this crisis as some form of, warfare? I mean, are they deliberately attacking the U.S. with fentanyl?
That's a question that's been debated a lot, and it gets into some really complicated history and geopolitical tension. I mean, the idea of China using fentanyl as a weapon against the U.S. might sound like something out of a spy thriller, but some people who believe this theory point to a couple of historical connections that they find interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. What kind of historical connections are we talking about here? Ancient grudges, secret societies.
Haha, not quite that dramatic.
Okay.
But there are these two historical threads that some find, let's say, thought-provoking. First, there's Paul Janssen. He was the Belgian doctor who actually invented fentanyl back in the 1950s. And he had this close relationship with China, even helping them with preserving those, incredible terracotta warrior statues.
So the idea is that because the inventor of fentanyl had these ties to China, maybe there's some deeper link there. I guess I can see how that might spark some speculation.
Right, adds a layer of intrigue, even if it's circumstantial. But the second historical argument is actually a lot darker. It goes back to the Opium Wars in the 19th century.
Oh yeah, the Opium Wars. That was a brutal chapter in history. Forced opium addiction on a massive scale, a truly tragic period. But how does that connect to what's happening with fentanyl today?
Well, during the Opium Wars, Britain and France basically forced China to open up to the opium trade, which led to widespread addiction and, social unrest. Millions of Chinese people became addicted, and it really weakened the country.
So are you saying that the theory is that China is now getting revenge by using fentanyl as like a modern-day opium to weaken the West, like an eye for an eye on a global scale?
Yeah, that's the idea some people are putting forward, but we have to remember this is just one interpretation of events. I mean, is it really about revenge, or is China just taking advantage of a problem that already exists in the U.S.? It's hard to say for sure.
Right, it's definitely complicated. And I'm sure China's official stance is a little more, shall we say, diplomatic than we're getting you back for the opium wars.
Yeah.
So what is their official position on the fentanyl crisis?
Their official position is that they see it as purely a legal matter. They say they've cooperated with the U.S. by cracking down on certain fentanyl precursors when America asked them to. And they argue that the fentanyl crisis is mostly driven by demand and addiction problems within the U.S., not by anything they're doing.
So they're basically saying, look, we did what you asked. This isn't our responsibility.
Pretty much, that's the gist of their argument. They've even taken some action against fentanyl production and distribution networks within China. Like, they shut down some online platforms that were selling these chemicals after Biden met with Xi Jinping.
Okay, so it seems like they're trying to walk this fine line. They don't want to be seen as the bad guys, but they're also not willing to accept full responsibility or just do whatever the U.S. wants.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting from a geopolitical perspective. China sees this as part of a bigger power struggle between the two countries. They're essentially saying, if you want us to fully cooperate on fentanyl, you need to give us something in return, like concessions on trade or Taiwan.
So they're using the fentanyl crisis as leverage to get what they want in other areas. That seems incredibly risky given how many people are dying.
It's a very high-stakes game, and it definitely raises some serious ethical questions. I mean, while these two superpowers are maneuvering for position, people are dying every day from fentanyl overdoses. It's easy to get lost in the geopolitical drama, but we can't forget about the real human cost of this crisis.
Absolutely, and it's not like Americans are just sitting back and taking this. The video mentions that most Americans actually hold their own government responsible for addressing the fentanyl crisis. They don't just blame China.
That's right. Public opinion polls show that Americans want their leaders to take real action to fight this crisis. They see it as a domestic problem that needs a domestic solution.
But it seems like despite all the public outcry, not much is actually being done. The video talks about how the fentanyl crisis has become a political football, with politicians making promises but not delivering any real solutions.
It's a sad but familiar story in American politics. Politicians from both sides use the issue to score points, but there's been very little real progress, just a lot of blame and inaction while people are dying.
It's really heartbreaking. It makes you wonder if maybe we need to shift our focus away from just trying to stop the supply of fentanyl and look at other options.
I think that's a really important conversation to have. What if, in addition to trying to cut off the supply, we also invested heavily in harm reduction strategies?
Harm reduction, huh? That sounds like a completely different approach. What does that actually look like in practice?
So harm reduction is all about minimizing the negative consequences of drug use, rather than just trying to stop people from using drugs altogether. It's about recognizing that drug use is a reality and finding ways to make it less harmful.
So things like needle exchange programs, fentanyl testing strips, and expanding access to treatment. But wouldn't that be seen as like condoning drug use?
That's a common criticism, but people who support harm reduction argue that it's a more pragmatic and compassionate approach. It's about saving lives, even if it means accepting that people are going to continue to use drugs.
That's a really interesting point. It's definitely a controversial issue. But given how bad the fentanyl crisis is, it seems like we need to be open to all options, even if they challenge our preconceived ideas about drug use and addiction.
Absolutely, and that brings us to a really crucial point. The fentanyl crisis is incredibly complex. There are no easy answers.
Man, this deep dive has been, I don't know, it's been a lot. We've gone from like the chemistry of fentanyl to this whole global network of traffickers to the politics and the blame game. It's clear that this crisis is so multi-layered, there's no easy answers.
Yeah, I think what's really striking is how interconnected everything is. You have these cartels that are driven by, profit, then you have geopolitical stuff going on, and then you have this domestic crisis that's rooted in, addiction and all these societal issues.
And it's so easy to get caught up in all of that and forget that this is about real people. Like, real people are dying, families are being destroyed, communities are being torn apart. It's such a huge tragedy.
And that's why I think it's so important that we keep talking about it. We have to keep pushing for solutions, even if they're difficult or controversial. We can't just let this become another statistic, another headline that people forget about.
You're absolutely right. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of fentanyl, what are some key takeaways that you hope people will walk away with?
Well, first and foremost, I hope people come away with a better understanding of just how big and complex this crisis is. The numbers they're staggering, but we have to remember that those numbers represent real lives lost, real families that are hurting. This isn't just some problem happening somewhere else. It's affecting people all across the country.
And it's easy to fall into the trap of blaming China, blaming politicians, but we can't lose sight of the human cost of this crisis.
Yeah, exactly. It's also important to realize that there's no one bad guy here, no single solution that's going to fix everything. It's this whole web of interconnected factors, from how the drug is made to the social and economic problems that lead to addiction. It's a global problem that needs a multifaceted solution.
And I think that complexity is what makes it so hard to find solutions. It's not just about stopping the supply, it's about addressing the demand, the root causes of addiction, and finding ways to help people who are already struggling.
Right, and that leads me to my last point, which is that we need to be open-minded about solutions. We need to consider all the options, including things like harm reduction strategies, even if they challenge how we traditionally think about drug use and addiction.
Harm reduction, as we talked about before, is about minimizing the damage caused by drug use. It's about meeting people where they are, instead of just trying to force them to quit.
Exactly. Some people might say that it encourages drug use, but those who advocate for harm reduction say it's a more compassionate and effective way to save lives. It's about accepting the reality of addiction and trying to reduce the harm it causes to individuals and to society.
So what can people do? I mean, it could feel really overwhelming when you're faced with a crisis like this.
Well, the first thing is stay informed. Keep learning about the issue. Don't just rely on headlines. Dig a little deeper, question what you hear, and don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions.
Yeah, and it's not just about learning. It's about talking about it, sharing what you learn, and speaking up for change. Talk to your friends and family. Reach out to your elected officials. Support organizations that are working to address this crisis.
This isn't just something for politicians or the police to solve. It's a challenge for all of us. We need to educate ourselves, have honest conversations, and advocate for solutions that are based on compassion and harm reduction.
We need to move away from judgment and stigma and towards understanding and empathy. The people who are struggling with addiction are not criminals, they're people who need our help.
And lastly, remember that this conversation doesn't end here. Keep researching, keep asking questions, keep pushing for change. It's going to be a long journey, but I believe that if we work together, we can make a real difference.
I agree. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you'll continue to explore this important issue and use your voice to advocate for change. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.